Welcome to our Bonded Book Club Hidden Figures Discussion Video 1 of 5. I will be starting off today and Sam will be following up starting at 1 o'clock. And we're so excited to bring you a discussion of hidden figures. And you know, this book has gotten a lot of popularity in part because of the movie, but I think what's so interesting about this book is really the stories and the stories that they share, or that Margot Lee Shetterly shares. This book is by Margot Lee Shetterly. She is a black woman who grew up in Virginia, and her father was a scientist at NASA. And this entire book really takes place mostly in Virginia, on a campus of NASA, which at the time was called NACA, and recounts stories of the black women who, beginning in the 1930s and 40s, helped to propel the United States into space, which is really wild. So they worked on everything from planes during World War II time to eventually putting John Glenn into space and eventually the United States on the moon. And really this book begins during the time of World War II and the need that was necessitated during World War II because the majority of the men had gone off to fight overseas and work still needed to be done. We needed to figure out ways to create and to keep things running at home. And so the solution for many folks in the United States government at the time was to begin hiring women, specifically black women. So in this story, which is all true, Margot Lee Shetterly begins looking at the women who came before her father at NASA and really digging deep. She got to actually interview them. She got to talk to people who knew them, which is really unbelievable. The three women who are mostly profiled, there's a lot of women who come up in the book, but the three women who are mostly profiled are Dorothy Vaughan, Mary Jackson, and Katherine Johnson. And Katherine Johnson is actually still living. Her work was very directly correlated with putting John Glenn into orbit, and she was recently honored several years ago by President Obama for her work that she did and everything that she contributed finally. But I think what makes this book and these stories so interesting and compelling is how difficult the work was, how intellectually challenging the work was, and how persistent the women are in this book, despite the odds at being stacked against them, racially, gender-wise, economically, in every way imaginable. And they really persisted, to use a word that's been popularized lately. They really persisted, and they persisted in spite of never getting the accolades, the promotions, or the recognition, really. Katherine Johnson just got recognized by President Obama, and she's in her 90s now. Dorothy Vaughan and Mary Jackson never got to have that. So I think it's really, these stories are so important and so compelling and really need to be told. So I was thrilled to read Hidden Figures. It was a fantastic book. So just to start off a few things, I wanted to read a Margot Lee Shetterly's author's note in here because I'm going to be reading some quotes from the book. I just want to make sure that everything is clear. So she says, "Though some readers may find the language of Hidden Figures discordant to their modern ears, I've made every attempt to remain true to the time period and to the voices of the individuals represented in the story." So she uses words like colored and Negro, Indian, and girls, which are obviously these days found to be offensive and inappropriate, and especially in certain contexts. So anyways, when I'm reading quotes from the book, I don't want any of that to be misconstrued. They are direct quotes from the book. And where we're getting most of our questions from today is if you picked up a more recent version of Hidden Figures, there is a reading group guide in the back of the book which has some really great questions. So we're going to be working through those with you today. So our first question starts off. As the book opens, the reader meets Melvin Butler, The white personnel officer at Langley, who was searching desperately for qualified mathematicians and wound up hiring black women for jobs that historically had gone only to white men. Shetterly muses, quote, maybe Melvin Butler was progressive for his time and place, or maybe he was just a functionary carrying out his duty. Maybe he was both, end quote. Which do you think it was? So it's hard for me to imagine a white man working for the federal government in the era of Jim Crow being particularly progressive at the time. But it's definitely possible. I think that World War II really pushed people to look outside of normal workforce in order to meet the needs that were popping up as the war progressed. I think the war pushed people to prioritize needs above their inherent biases, which worked in the favor of the women at Langley and helped them to get a foot in the door and be able to prove themselves. My gut instinct is that it's possible that Melvin could have done this before, that maybe he would have been open to hiring women, specifically black women, but perhaps his rigid biases and social constructs at the time prevented him from doing that. The war, in a kind of morbid way, opened a door for women and for black women specifically and created this opportunity that wasn't there before. Something that was promised to the black community throughout the book, as Shetterly talks about, is that the war was going to be this opportunity to end all of the racial conflicts that had developed in the United States. And as we know, that did not come to fruition, that never happened, but it was promised to people in order to get them to help contribute. And obviously that did not happen, but it's possible that Melvin was progressive. It's hard to imagine that in the 1930s, but it's possible. Okay, so the next question is, the author says of young Dorothy Vaughan, quote, possessed of an inner confidence that attributed no shortcoming to her race or her gender, Dorothy welcomed the chance to prove herself in a non-competitive academic arena. How did this approach to life help her at Langley, and was this attitude shared by other women in West computing? So definitely, I think Dorothy Vaughan's confidence helped her tremendously, especially in a male-dominated, scientific, pretty rigid environment. She was incredibly competent, and she had every right to be confident in her competence. So I think that that's also a really important thing to remember, is that these women were incredibly bright. They worked so hard, they were so smart, so they had every right to be confident in their abilities. Just because other people didn't recognize that immediately at the time didn't mean that they shouldn't have been confident in their abilities. Her confidence is what helped to move her up through the ranks at Langley, and ultimately what helped her to advocate on behalf of not just herself, but also on behalf of other women, including white women, and to help them move up the ranks at Langley. She stepped into a leadership position when she was needed and pressured upper management to hire her West computing women into full-time positions and to promote them and could get them on research projects. I mean, her confidence was really remarkable, but she had every right to be confident, is sort of how I see it. She was smart. She was smart as fuck. Okay, so the second question is, was it an attitude shared by other women and in West computing, which was the area that Dorothy ultimately managed, which was an all-black female group of computers. So they were doing like differential equations from start to finish, dawn till dusk every day, which is just insane for me because I don't do math. Math is not my favorite. So I'm just stunned and amazed by the work that they were doing. I would never want to speak on behalf of an entire group, but I think the attitude that Dorothy was sort of like top down. So she was very confident, and so that made the people who worked for her confident, not only in themselves and their abilities, but in her as well. And so it sort of trickled down, and she had extremely high standards for all of her employees and for herself. And that helped to raise the bar and really show the traditionally white, male-centric Langley area that these women can do this work, that they are fully capable, they are competent and confident in their abilities. So for some, they did mention at one point in the book that some of the women who worked for her and in West Computing, it was very challenging to work in these environments. But I think for the most part, Dorothy raised the bar, and her confidence definitely trickled down to the women that she worked for. After World War II ended, some women did go back to their homes, and they did go back to home life and left the working sector. But I think part of that was, you know, despite Dorothy being incredibly confident in her abilities and incredibly competent, she still dealt with a lot of inherent sexism and racism on a daily basis, and that gets really old really fast. So I think that there was a portion of the women who worked at Langley and who worked for Dorothy who maybe didn't want to deal with that anymore. It gets really old, and putting in all the time, effort, and not getting the status, the pay as a man down the hall who's doing the exact same thing, that chips away at your confidence no matter what. Dorothy never let it eat at her, but and she held the people who work for her to that same standard, but at the same time, I think it was a lot for some women to deal with, and who can blame them? So those are the first two questions. Sam will be coming back at 1 o'clock for the next two questions. I'll be back at 2, she'll be back at 3, and then I'll be back at 4:30, and we will continue this discussion. I'm gonna put the questions in the paragraph once I post this video, and if you want to respond and give your thoughts, if you've read Hidden Figures, I would love to read and have a conversation in the comments. So I'll see you guys at 2. Bye!